Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I very much appreciate you including me in your facility here. Now, looking around the room, I think I see just one bow tie. Is that right? Just one. I'm telling you, once you try. Oh, yes, two. That's great. I started wearing bow ties when I was young in high school. My father showed me, his father showed him. And there's a story associated with this, which I find remarkable. My grandfather was in the Rotary, and he attended a convention in Philadelphia. And even in those days, at the turn of the last century, people rented tuxedos. And the tuxedo came with a bow tie, untied bow tie. So he didn't know how to tie it, so wasn't sure what to do, but he just took a chance. He went to the hotel room next door, knocked on the door, "Excuse me, can you help me tie my tie?" And the guy said, "Sure, lie down on the bed." So my grandfather, wanted to have the tie on, wasn't sure what he was getting into, so he is said to have lain on the bed, and the guy tied a perfect bow tie knot, and quite reasonably, my grandfather said, "Thank you. Why'd I have to lie down on the bed?" The guy said, "I'm an undertaker." It's really the only way I know how to do it. Now, that story was presented to me as a true story. It may or may not be, but it gives you something to think about, and it's certainly something to remember. So here tonight, we're going to have two stories, and we can compare Mr. Ham's story to the story from what I will call the outside, from mainstream science. The question tonight is, does Ken Ham's creation model hold up? Is it viable? So let me ask you all, what would you be doing if you weren't here tonight? That's right, you'd be home watching CSI. CSI Petersburg. Is that coming? I think it's coming. And on CSI, there is no distinction made between historical science and observational science. These are constructs unique to Mr. Ham. We don't normally have these anywhere in the world except here. Natural laws that applied in the past apply now. That's why they're natural laws. That's why we embrace them. That's how we made all these discoveries that enabled all this remarkable technology. So CSI is a fictional show, but it's based absolutely on real people doing real work. When you go to a crime scene and find evidence, you have clues about the past. And you trust those clues, and you embrace them, and you move forward to convict somebody. Mr. Ham and his followers have this remarkable view of a worldwide flood that somehow influenced everything that we observe in nature. A 500-foot wooden boat, 8 zookeepers for 14,000 individual animals, every land plant in the world underwater for a full year. I ask us all, is that really reasonable? You'll hear a lot about the Grand Canyon, I imagine, also, which is a remarkable place, and it has fossils. And the fossils in the Grand Canyon are found in layers. There is not a single place in the Grand Canyon where the fossils of one type of animal cross over into the fossils of another. In other words, when there was a big flood on the earth, you would expect drowning animals to swim up to a higher level. Not any one of them did, not a single one. If you could find evidence of that, my friends, you could change the world. Now, I just want to remind us all, there are billions of people in the world who are deeply religious, who get enriched, who have a wonderful sense of community from their religion. They worship together, they eat together, they live in their communities and enjoy each other's company. Billions of people, but these same people do not embrace the extraordinary view that the earth is somehow only 6,000 years old. That is unique. And here's my concern. What keeps the United States ahead, what makes the United States a world leader, is our technology, our new ideas, our innovations. If we continue to eschew science, eschew the process, and try to divide science into observational science and historic science, we are not going to move forward. We will not embrace natural laws. We will not make discoveries. We will not invent and innovate and stay ahead. So if you ask me if Ken Ham's creation model is viable, I say no. It is absolutely not viable. So stay with us over the next period, and you can compare my evidence to his. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much. And Mr. Ham, I learned something. Thank you. But let's take it back around to the question at hand. Does Ken Ham's creation model hold up? Is it viable? So for me, of course, well, take a look. We're here in Kentucky on layer upon layer upon layer of limestone. I stopped at the side of the road today and picked up just a piece of limestone that has a fossil right there. Now, in these many, many layers, in this vicinity of Kentucky, there are coral animals, fossil, zooxanthellae. And when you look at it closely, you can see that they live their entire lives. They lived typically 20 years, sometimes more than that, if the water conditions are correct. And so we are standing on millions of layers of ancient life. How could those animals have lived their entire life and formed these layers in just 4,000 years? There isn't enough time since Mr. Ham's flood for this limestone that we're standing on to have come into existence. My scientific colleagues go to places like Greenland, the Arctic, they go to Antarctica, and they drill into the ice with hollow drill bits. It's not that extraordinary. Many of you have probably done it yourselves, drilling other things, hole saws to put locks in doors, for example. And we pull out long cylinders of ice, long ice rods. And these are made of snow. And by long tradition, it's called snow ice. And snow ice forms over the winter as snowflakes fall and are crushed down by subsequent layers. They're crushed together and trapping the little bubbles. And the little bubbles must needs be ancient atmosphere. There's nobody running around with a hypodermic needle squirting ancient atmosphere into the bubbles. And we find certain of these cylinders to have 680,000 layers. 680,000 snow, winter, summer cycles. How could it be that just 4,000 years ago, all of this ice formed? Let's just run some numbers. This is some scenes from lovely Antarctic. Let's say we have 680,000 layers of snow ice and 4,000 years since the Great Flood. That would mean we'd need 170 winter-summer cycles every year for the last 4,000 years. I mean, wouldn't someone have noticed that? Wow, wouldn't someone have noticed that there's been winter, summer 170 times one year? If we go to California, we find enormous stands of bristlecone pines. Some of them are over 6,000 years old, 6,800 years old. There's a famous tree in Sweden, Old Tycho, is 9,550 years old. How could these trees be there if there was an enormous flood just 4,000 years ago? You can try this yourself, everybody. I don't mean to be mean to trees, but get a sapling and put it underwater for a year. It will not survive in general, nor will its seeds. They just won't make it. So how could these trees be that old if the earth is only 4,000 years old? Now, when we go to the Grand Canyon, which is an astonishing place, and I recommend to everybody in the world to someday visit the Grand Canyon, you find layer upon layer of ancient rocks. And if there was this enormous flood that you speak of, wouldn't there have been churning and bubbling and roiling? How would these things have settled out? Your claim that they settled out in an extraordinary short amount of time is, for me, not satisfactory. You can look at these rocks, you can look at rocks that are younger, you can go to seashores where there's sand. This is what geologists on the outside do, study the rate at which soil is deposited at the end of rivers and deltas, and we can see that it takes a long, long time for sediments to turn to stone. Also, in this picture, you can see where one type of sediment has intruded on another type. Now, if that was uniform, wouldn't we expect it all to be even without intrusion? Furthermore, you can find places in the Grand Canyon where you see an ancient riverbed on that side going to an ancient riverbed on that side, and the Colorado River has cut through it. And by the way, if this great flood drained through the Grand Canyon, wouldn't there have been a Grand Canyon on every continent? How could we not have Grand Canyons everywhere if this water drained away in this extraordinary short amount of time, 4,000 years? Now, when you look at these layers carefully, you find these beautiful fossils. And when I say beautiful, I am inspired by them. They're remarkable because we are looking at the past. You find down low, you'll find what you might consider as rudimentary sea animals. Up above, you'll find the famous trilobites. Above that, you might find some clams, some oysters. And above that, you'll find some mammals. You never, ever find a higher animal mixed in with a lower one. You never find a lower one trying to swim its way to the higher one. If it all happened in such an extraordinary short amount of time, if this water drained away just like that, wouldn't we expect to see some turbulence? And by the way, anyone here, really, if you can find one example of that anywhere in the world, the scientists of the world challenge you. They would embrace you. You would be a hero. You would change the world if you could find one example of that anywhere. People have looked and looked and looked. They have not found a single one. Now here's an interesting thing. These are fossil skulls that people have found all around the world. It's by no means representative of all the fossil skulls that have been found, but these are all over the place. Now, if you were to look at these, I can assure you not any of them is a gorilla, right? If, as Mr. Ham and his associates claim, there was just man and then everybody else, there were just humans and all other species, where would you put modern humans among these skulls? How did all these skulls get all over the earth in these extraordinary fashion? Where would you put us? Well, I can tell you we are on there, and I encourage you, when you go home, to look it up. Now, one of the extraordinary claims associated with Mr. Ham's worldview is that this giant boat, very large wooden ship, went aground safely on a mountain in the Middle East, what we now call the Middle East. And so places like Australia are populated then by animals who somehow managed to get from the Middle East all the way to Australia in the last 4,000 years. Now that to me is an extraordinary claim. We would expect then, somewhere between the Middle East and Australia, we would expect to find evidence of kangaroos. We would expect to find some fossils, some bones. In the last 4,000 years, somebody would have been hopping along there and died along the way, and we'd find them. And furthermore, there's a claim that there was a land bridge that allowed these animals to get from Asia all the way to the continent of Australia, and that land bridge has disappeared in the last 4,000 years. No navigator, no diver, no U.S. Navy submarine, no one's ever detected any evidence of this, let alone any fossils of kangaroos. So your expectation is not met. It doesn't seem to hold up. So let's see, if there are 4,000 years since Ken Ham's flood, and let's say, as he said many times, there are 7,000 kinds. Today, the very, very lowest estimate is that there are about 8.7 million species, but a much more reasonable estimate is it's 50 million or even 100 million when you start counting the viruses and the bacteria and all the beetles that must be extant in the tropical rainforest that we haven't found. So we'll take a number which I think is pretty reasonable, 16 million species today, okay? If these came from 7,000 kinds, that's, let's say we have 7,000 subtracted from 15 million, that's 15,993. We have 4,000 years, we have 365 and a quarter days a year. We would expect to find 11 new species every day. So you'd go out into your yard, you wouldn't just find a different bird, a new bird, you'd find a different kind of bird, a whole new species, a bird, every day. a new species of fish, a new species of organisms you can't see, and so on. I mean, this would be enormous news. The last 4,000 years, people would have seen these changes among us. So the Cincinnati Enquirer, I imagine, would carry a column right next to the weather report. Today's new species, and it would list these 11 every day. But we see no evidence of that. There's no evidence of these species. There just simply isn't enough time. Now, as you may know, I was graduated from engineering school, and I got a job at Boeing. I worked on 747s. Okay, everybody relax. I was very well supervised. Everything's fine. There's a tube in the 747 I kind of think of as my tube. But that aside, I traveled the highways of Washington State quite a bit. I was a young guy. I had a motorcycle. I used to go mountain climbing in Washington State, Oregon. And you can drive along and find these enormous boulders on top of the ground. Enormous rocks, huge, sitting on top of the ground. Now, out there in regular academic pursuits, regular geology, people have discovered that there used to be a lake in what is now Montana, which we charmingly refer to as Lake Missoula. It's not there now, but the evidence for it, of course, is, if I may, overwhelming. And so an ice dam would form at Lake Missoula, and once in a while it would break. It would build up and break, and there were multiple floods in my old state of Washington State. And just before we go on, let me just say, go Seahawks. That was very gratifying for me. Anyway, you drive along the road, and there are these rocks. So if, as is asserted here at this facility, that the heavier rocks would sink to the bottom during a flood event, the big rocks, and especially their shape, instead of aerodynamic, the hydrodynamic, the water-changing shape as water flows past. You'd expect them to sink to the bottom. But here are these enormous rocks right on the surface, and there's no shortage of them. If you go driving in Washington State or Oregon, they're readily available. So how could those be there if the Earth is just 4,000 years old? How could they be there if this one flood caused that? Another remarkable thing I'd like everybody to consider, inherent in this worldview, is that somehow Noah and his family were able to build a wooden ship that would house 14,000 individuals. There are 7,000 kinds, and there's a boy and a girl for each one of those. So it's about 14,008 people. And these people were unskilled. As far as anybody knows, they had never built a wooden ship before. Furthermore, they had to get all these animals on there, and they had to feed them, and I understand that Mr. Ham has some explanations for that, which I frankly find extraordinary, but this is the premise of the bit. And we can then run a test, a scientific test. People in the early 1900s built an extraordinarily large wooden ship, the Wyoming. It was a 6-masted schooner, the largest one ever built. It had a motor on it for winching cables and stuff. But this boat had a great difficulty. It was not as big as the Titanic, but it was a very long ship. It would twist in the sea. It would twist this way, and this way. And in all that twisting, it leaked. It leaked like crazy. The crew could not keep the ship dry. And indeed, it eventually foundered and sank, loss of all 14 hands. So there were 14 crewmen aboard a ship built by very, very skilled shipwrights in New England. These guys were the best in the world at wooden shipbuilding. And they couldn't build a boat as big as the Ark is claimed to have been. Is that reasonable? Is that possible? That the best shipbuilders in the world couldn't do what 8 unskilled people, men and their wives, were able to do. If you visit the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., it's 163 acres, and they have 400 species. By the way, this picture that you're seeing was taken by spacecraft in space, orbiting the Earth. If you told my grandfather, let alone my father, that we had that capability, they would have been amazed. That capability comes from our fundamental understanding of gravity, of material science, of physics. and life science, where you go looking. This place is often, as any zoo, is often deeply concerned and criticized for how it treats its animals. They have 400 species on 163 acres, 66 hectares. Is it reasonable that Noah and his colleagues, his family, were able to maintain 14,000 animals and themselves and feed them aboard a ship that was bigger than anyone's ever been able to build? Now, here's the thing. What we want in science, science as practiced out on the outside, is an ability to predict. We want to have a natural law that is so obvious and clear, so well understood, that we can make predictions about what will happen. We can predict that we can put a spacecraft in orbit and take a picture of Washington, D.C. We can predict that if we provide this much room for an elephant, it will live healthily for a certain amount of time. So I'll give you an example. In the explanation provided by traditional science of how we came to be, we find, as Mr. Ham alluded to many times in his recent remarks, we find a sequence of animals in what generally is called the fossil record. This would be to say, when we look at the layers that you would find in Kentucky, you look at them carefully, you find a sequence of animals, a succession. And as one might expect, when you're looking at old records, there's some pieces seem to be missing, a gap. So scientists got to thinking about this. There are lungfish that jump from pond to pond in Florida and end up in people's swimming pools. And there are amphibians, frogs and toads, croaking and carrying on. And so people wondered if there wasn't a fossil or an organism, an animal that had lived, that had characteristics of both. People over the years had found that in Canada, there was clearly a fossil marsh, a place that used to be a swamp, had dried out. And they found all kinds of happy swamp fossils there, ferns, so on, organisms, animals, fish that were recognized. And people realized that if this, with the age of the rocks there, as computed by traditional scientists, with the age of the rocks there, this would be a reasonable place to look for an animal, a fossil of an animal that lived there. And indeed, scientists found it, Tiktaalik, this fish lizard guy. And they found several specimens. It wasn't one individual. In other words, they made a prediction that this animal would be found, and it was found. So far, Mr. Ham and his worldview, the Ken Ham creation model, does not have this capability. It cannot make predictions and show results. Here's an extraordinary one that I find remarkable. There are certain fish, the top minnows, that have the remarkable ability to have sex with other fish, traditional fish sex, and they can have sex with themselves. Now, one of the old questions in life science, everybody, one of the old sort of chin strokers, is why does any organism, whether you're an ash tree, a sea jelly, a squid, a marmot, why does anybody have sex? I mean, there are more bacteria in your tummy right now than there are humans on Earth. And bacteria, they don't bother with that, man. They just like split themselves in half. They get new bacteria. Like, let's get her done. Let's go. But why does think of all the trouble a rose bush goes to make a flower, and the thorns and the bees swimming, flying around, interacting. Why does anybody bother with all that? And the answer seems to be your enemies. And your enemies are not lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, no. Your enemies are germs and parasites. That's what's going to get you. Germs and parasites. My first cousin's son died tragically from essentially the flu. This is not some story I heard about. It's my first cousin once removed. Because apparently the virus had the right genes to attack his genes. So when you have sex, you have a new set of genes. You have a new mixture. So people studied these top minnows, and they found that the ones who reproduce sexually had fewer parasites than the ones that reproduced on their own, this black spot disease. Wait, there's more. In these populations, with flooding and so on, with river ponds get isolated, then they dry up, then the river flows again. In between, some of the fish will have sex with other fish sometimes, and they'll have sex on their own, what's called asexually. And those fish, the ones that are in between, sometimes this, sometimes that, they have an intermediate number of infections. In other words, the explanation provided by evolution made a prediction. And the prediction's extraordinary and subtle, but there it is. How else would you explain it? And to Mr. Ham and his followers, I say this is something that we in science want. We want the ability to predict. And your assertion that there's some difference between the natural laws that I use to observe the world today and the natural laws that existed 4,000 years ago is extraordinary and unsettling. I travel around. I have a great many family members in Danville, Virginia, one of the U.S.'s most livable cities. It's lovely. And I was driving along, and there was a sign in front of a church, Big Bang Theory, you got to be kidding me, God. Now, everybody, why would someone at the church, a pastor, for example, put that sign up unless he or she didn't believe that the Big Bang was a real thing? I just want to review briefly with everybody why we accept, in the outside world, why we accept the Big Bang. Edwin Hubble, oh, sorry, there you go. You got to be kidding me, God. Edwin Hubble was sitting at Mount Wilson, which is up from Pasadena, California. On a clear day, you can look down and see where the Rose Parade goes. It's that close to civilization. But even in the early 1900s, the people who selected this site for astronomy picked an excellent site. The clouds and smog are below you. And Edwin Hubble sat there at this very big telescope night after night studying the heavens. And he found that the stars are moving apart. The stars are moving apart. And he wasn't sure why, but it was clear that the stars are moving farther and farther apart all the time. So people talked about it for a couple decades. And then eventually another astronomer, almost a couple decades, another astronomer, Fred Hoyle, just remarked, well, it was like there was a Big Bang. There was an explosion. This is to say, since everything's moving apart, it's very reasonable that at one time they were all together. And there's a place from whence these things expanded. And it was a remarkable insight. But people went still questioning it for decades. Science and conventional scientists questioning it for decades. These two researchers wanted to listen for radio signals from space, radio astronomy. And this is, while we have visible light for our eyes, there's a whole nother bunch of waves of light that are much longer. The microwaves in your oven are about that long. The radar at the airport is about that long. Your FM radio signals about like this. AM radio signals are a kilometer. They're several soccer fields. They went out listening, and there was this hiss, this tss, all the time that wouldn't go away. And they thought, oh, doggone it, there's some loose connector. They plugged in the connector. They re-screwed it. They made it tight. They turned it this way. The hiss was still there. They heard it that way. It's just still there. They thought it was pigeon droppings that had affected the reception of this horn, it's called. This thing is still there. It's in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. It's a National Historic Site. And Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson had found this cosmic background sound that was predicted by astronomers. Astronomers running the numbers, doing math, predicted that in the cosmos would be left over this echo, this energy from the Big Bang that would be detectable. And they detected it. We built the Cosmic Observatory for Background Emissions, the COBE spacecraft, and it matched exactly the astronomers' predictions. You got to respect that. It's a wonderful thing. Now, along that line, is some interest in the age of the Earth. Right now, it's generally agreed that the Big Bang happened 13.7 billion years ago. What we can do on Earth, these elements that we all know on the periodic table of chemicals, even ones we don't know, were created when stars explode. And I look like nobody, but I attended a lecture by Hans Bethe, who won a Nobel Prize for discovering the process by which stars create all these elements. The one that interests me especially is our good friends rubidium and strontium. Rubidium becomes strontium spontaneously. It's an interesting thing to me. A neutron becomes a proton, and it goes up the periodic table. When lava comes out of the ground, molten lava, and it freezes, turns to rock, when the melt solidifies or crystallizes, it locks the rubidium and strontium in place. And so by careful assay, by being diligent, you can tell when the rock froze. You can tell how old the rubidium and strontium are, and you can get an age for the Earth. When that stuff falls on fossils, you can get a very good idea of how old the fossils are. I encourage you all to go to Nebraska, go to Ashfall State Park, and see the astonishing fossils. It looks like a Hollywood movie. There are rhinoceroses, there are three-toed horses in Nebraska. None of those animals are extant today, and they were buried catastrophically by a volcano in what is now Idaho, is now Yellowstone National Park. It's called the hot spot. People call it the super volcano. And it's a remarkable thing. Apparently, as I can tell you, as a Northwesterner around for Mount St. Helens, full disclosure, I'm on the Mount St. Helens board. When it goes off, it gives out a great deal of gas that's toxic and knocks these animals out. Looking for relief, they go to a watering hole, and then when the ash comes, they were all buried. It's an extraordinary place. Now, if in the bad old days you had heart problems, they would right away cut you open. Now we use a drug based on rubidium to look at the inside of your heart without cutting you open. Now, my Kentucky friends, I want you to consider this. Right now, there is no place in the Commonwealth of Kentucky to get a degree in this kind of nuclear medicine, this kind of drugs associated with that. I hope you find that troubling. I hope you're concerned about that. You want scientifically literate students in your Commonwealth for a better tomorrow for everybody. You can't get this here. You have to go out of state. Now, as far as the distance to stars, understand this is very well understood. It's February. We look at a star in February, we measure an angle to it, we wait 6 months, we look at that same star again, and we measure that angle. It's the same way carpenters built this building. It's the same way surveyors surveyed the land that we're standing on. And so by measuring the distance to a star, you can figure out how far away it is, that star, and then the stars beyond it and stars beyond that. There are billions of stars, more than 6,000 light years from here. A light year is a unit of distance, not a unit of time. There are billions of stars. Mr. Ham, how could there be billions of stars more distant than 6,000 years if the world's only 6,000 years old? It's an extraordinary claim. There's another astronomer, Adolf Kittel, who remarked first about the reasonable man. Is it reasonable that we have ice older by a factor of 100 than you claim the Earth is? We have trees that have more tree rings than the Earth is old. That we have rocks with rubidium and strontium and uranium and potassium argon dating that are far, far, far older than you claim the Earth is. Could anybody have built an ark that would sustain better than any ark anybody was able to build on the Earth? So if you're asking me, and I got the impression you were, is Ken Ham's creation model viable? I say no, absolutely not. Now, one last thing. You may not know that in the U.S. Constitution, from the Founding Fathers, is the sentence to promote the progress of science and useful arts. Kentucky voters who might be watching online in places like Texas, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Kansas, please, you don't want to raise a generation of science students who don't understand how we know our place in the cosmos, our place in space, who don't understand natural law. We need to innovate to keep the United States where it is in the world. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me start with the beginning. If you find 45 million year old rock on top of 45,000 year old trees, maybe the rock slid on top. Maybe that's it. That seems much more reasonable explanation than it's impossible. As far as dating goes, actually the methods are very reliable. One of the mysteries or interesting things that people in my business, especially at the Planetary Society, are interested in is why all the asteroids seem to be so close to the same date. It's in age, 4.5, 4.6 billion years. It's a remarkable thing. People at first expected a little more of a spread. So I understand that you take the Bible as written in English, translated not countless, but many, many times over the last 3 millennia, as to be a more accurate, more reasonable assessment of the natural laws we see around us than what I and everybody in here can observe. That to me is unsettling, troubling. And then about the disease thing, are the fish sinners? Have they done something wrong to get diseases? That's sort of an extraordinary claim that takes me just a little past what I'm comfortable with. And then as far as you can't observe the past, I have to stop you right there. That's what we do in astronomy. All we can do is in astronomy is look at the past. By the way, you're looking at the past right now because the speed of light bounces off of me and then gets to your eyes. And I'm delighted to see that the people in the back of the room appear just that much younger than the people in the front. So this idea that you can separate the natural laws of the past from the natural laws that we have now, I think is at the heart of our disagreement. I don't see how we're ever going to agree with that if you insist that natural laws have changed. It's, for lack of a better word, it's magical. And I have appreciated magic since I was a kid, but it's not really what we want in conventional mainstream science. So your assertion that all the animals were vegetarians before they got on the ark, that's really remarkable. I have not spent a lot of time with lions, but I can tell they've got teeth that really aren't set up for broccoli. That these animals were vegetarians till this flood is something that I would ask you to provide a little more proof for. I give you the lion's teeth. You give me verses as translated into English over, 30 centuries? So that is not enough evidence for me. If you've ever played telephone, I remember very well in kindergarten, where you have a secret and you whisper it to the next person, to the next person, to the next person. Things often go wrong. So it's very reasonable to me that instead of lions being vegetarians on the ark, lions are lions, and the information that you use to create your worldview is not consistent with what I as a reasonable man would expect. So I want everybody to consider the implications of this. If we accept Mr. Ham's point of view, that Mr. Ham's point of view, that the Bible as translated into American English serves as a science text, and that he and his followers will interpret that for you, I want you to consider what that means. It means that Mr. Ham's word, or his interpretation of these other words, is somehow to be more respected than what you can observe in nature, what you can find literally in your backyard in Kentucky. It's a troubling and unsettling point of view, and it's one I'd very much like you to address when you come back. As far as the 5 races that you mentioned, it's kind of the same thing. The 5 races were claimed by people who were of European descent, and they said, hey, we're the best, check us out. And that turns out to be, if you've ever traveled anywhere or done anything, not to be that way. People are much more alike than they are different. So are we supposed to take your word for English words translated over the last 30 centuries instead of what we can observe in the universe around us? Thank you, Mr. Ham, but I'm completely unsatisfied. You did not, in my view, address just fundamental questions. 680,000 years of snow ice layers, which require a winter-summer cycle. Let's say you have 2,000 kinds instead of 7. That makes the problem even more extraordinary. Multiplying 11 by by 3.5, we get to 35, 40 species every day that we don't see. They're not extant. In fact, you probably know we're losing species due to mostly human activity and the loss of habitat. Then, as far as Noah being an extraordinary shipwright, I'm very skeptical. The shipwrights, my ancestors, the Nye family in New England, spent their whole life learning to make ships. I mean, it's very reasonable perhaps to you that Noah had superpowers and was able to build this extraordinary craft with 7 family members, but to me it's just not reasonable. Then, by the way, the fundamental thing we disagree on, Mr. Ham, is this nature of what you can prove to yourself. This is to say, when people make assumptions based on radiometric data, when they make assumptions about the expanding universe, when they make assumptions about the rate at which genes change in populations of bacteria in laboratory growth media, they're making assumptions based on previous experience. They're not coming out of whole cloth. So next time you have a chance to speak, I encourage you to explain to us why we should accept your word for it, that natural law changed just 4,000 years ago, completely, and there's no record of it. You know, there are pyramids that are older than that. There are human populations that are far older than that, with traditions that go back farther than that. And it's just not reasonable to me that everything changed 4,000 years ago. By everything, I mean the species, the surface of the earth, the stars in the sky, and the relationship of all the other living things on earth to humans. It's just not reasonable to me that everything changed like that. And another thing I would very much appreciate you addressing, there are billions of people in the world who are deeply religious, and I respect that. People get tremendous community and comfort and nurture and support from their religious fellows in their communities, in their faiths, in their churches, and yet they don't accept your point of view. There are Christians who don't accept that the earth could somehow be this extraordinarily young age because of all the evidence around them. And so, what is to become of them, in your view? And by the way, this thing started, as I understand it, Ken Ham's creation model is based on the Old Testament. So when you bring in, I'm not a theologian, when you bring in the New Testament, isn't that a little out of the box? I'm looking for explanations of the creation of the world as we know it, based on what I'm going to call science. Not historical science, not observational science. Things that each of us can do, akin to what we do. We're trying to outguess the characters on murder mystery shows, on crime scene investigation especially. What is to become of all those people who don't see it your way? For us in the scientific community, I remind you that when we find an idea that's not tenable, that doesn't work, that doesn't fly, doesn't hold water, whatever idiom you'd like to embrace, we throw it away. We're delighted. That's why I say if you can find a fossil that has swum between the layers, bring it on. You would change the world. If you could show that somehow the microwave background radiation is not a result of the Big Bang, come on, write your paper, tear it up. So your view that we're supposed to take your word for this book written centuries ago, translated into American English, is somehow more important than what I can see with my own eyes is an extraordinary claim. And for those watching online especially, I want to remind you that we need scientists, and especially engineers, for the future. Engineers use science to solve problems and make things. We need these people so that the United States can continue to innovate and continue to be a world leader. We need innovation, and that needs science education. Thank you. There's a question that troubles us all from the time we are absolutely youngest and first able to think. And that is, where did we come from? Where did I come from? And this question is so compelling that we've invented the science of astronomy. We've invented life science. We've invented physics. We've discovered these natural laws so that we can learn more about our origin and where we came from. To you, when it says he invented the stars also, that's satisfying. You're done. Oh, good, okay. To me, when I look at the night sky, I want to know what's out there. I'm driven. I want to know if what's out there is any part of me, and indeed it is. The oh, by the way, I find compelling, you are satisfied. And the big thing I want from you, Mr. Ham, is can you come up with something that you can predict? Do you have a creation model that predicts something that will happen in nature?
And that's time. Mr. Nye, the next question is for you. How did the atoms that created the Big Bang get there?
This is the great mystery. You've hit the nail on the head. No, this is so, what was before the Big Bang? This is what drives us. This is what we want to know. Let's keep looking. Let's keep searching. When I was young, it was presumed that the universe was slowing down. It's a Big Bang, except it's in outer space. There's no air, so it goes out like that. And so people presumed that it would slow down, that the universe, the gravity especially, would hold everything together, and maybe it's going to come back and explode again. And people went out, and the mathematical expression is the universe flat? This is a mathematical expression. Will the universe slow down asymptotically without ever stopping? Well, in 2004, Saul Perlmutter and his colleagues went looking for the rate at which the universe was slowing down. Let's go out and measure it. And we do it with this extraordinary system of telescopes around the world, looking at the night sky, looking for supernovae. These are standard brightness that you can infer distances with. And the universe isn't slowing down. It's accelerating. The universe is accelerating in its expansion. And do you know why? Nobody knows why. Nobody knows why. And you'll hear the expression nowadays, dark energy, dark matter, which are mathematical ideas that seem to reckon well with what seems to be the gravitational attraction of clusters of stars, galaxies, and their expansion. And then isn't it reasonable that whatever is out there causing the universe to expand is here also? And we just haven't figured out how to detect it. My friends, suppose a science student from the Commonwealth of Kentucky pursues a career in science and finds out the answer to that deep question. Where did we come from? What was before the Big Bang? To us, this is wonderful and charming and compelling. This is what makes us get up and go to work every day, is to try to solve the mysteries of the universe.
And that's time.
Thank you, Mr. Ham. I have to disabuse you of a fundamental idea. If a scientist, if anybody, makes a discovery that changes the way people view natural law, scientists embrace him or her. This person's fantastic. Louis Pasteur, you made reference to germs. No, if you find something that changes, that disagrees with common thought, that's the greatest thing going in science. We look forward to that change. We challenge you. Tell us why the universe is accelerating. Tell us why these mothers were getting sick. And we found an explanation for it. And but just the idea that the majority has sway in science is true only up to a point. And then the other thing I just want to point out, what you may have missed in evolutionary explanations of life is it's the mechanism by which we add complexity. The Earth is getting energy from the sun all the time, and that energy is used to make life forms somewhat more complex.
And that's time.
Don't know. This is a great mystery. A dear friend of mine is a neurologist. She studies the nature of consciousness. Now, I will say, I used to embrace a joke about dogs. I mean, who doesn't? And you can say, this guy remarked, "I've never seen a dog paralyzed by self-doubt." Actually, I have. Furthermore, the thing that we celebrate, there are 3 sundials on the planet Mars that bear an inscription to the future. To those who visit here, we wish a safe journey and the joy of discovery. It's inherently optimistic about the future of humankind, that we will one day walk on Mars. But the joy of discovery, that's what drives us. The joy of finding out what's going on. So we don't know where consciousness comes from, but we want to find out. Furthermore, I'll tell you, it's deep within us. I claim that I have spent time with dogs that have had the joy of discovery. It's way inside us. We have one ancestor, as near as we can figure. And by the way, if you can find what we in science call a second genesis, this is to say, did life start another way on the Earth? There are researchers at Astrobiology Institute, researchers supported by NASA, your tax dollars, that are looking for answer to that very question. Is it possible that life could start another way? Is there some sort of life form akin to science fiction that's crystal instead of membranous? This would be a fantastic discovery that would change the world. The nature of consciousness is a mystery. I challenge the young people here to investigate that very question. And I remind you, taxpayers and voters that might be watching, if we do not embrace the process of science, I mean in the mainstream, we will fall behind economically. This is a point I can't say enough. We would just need one piece of evidence. We would need the fossil that swam from one layer to another. We would need evidence that the universe is not expanding. We would need evidence that the stars appear to be far away, but they're not. We would need evidence that rock layers can somehow form in just 4,000 years instead of the extraordinary amount. We would need evidence that somehow you can reset atomic clocks and keep neutrons from becoming protons. You bring on any of those things and you would change me immediately. The question I have for you, though, fundamentally, and for everybody watching, Mr. Ham, what can you prove? What you have done tonight is spent most of all the time coming up with explanations about the past. What can you really predict? What can you really prove in a conventional scientific, or in a conventional, I have an idea that makes a prediction and it comes out the way I see it? This is very troubling to me. The age of the Earth. Well, the age of stars. Let's see. Radiometric evidence is pretty compelling. Also, the deposition rates. It was Lyell, a geologist, who realized, my recollection, he came up with the first use of the term deep time. When people realized that the Earth had to be much, much older. In a related story, there was a mystery as to how the Earth could be old enough to allow evolution to have taken place. How could the Earth possibly be 3 billion years old? Lord Kelvin did a calculation. If the sun were made of coal and burning, it couldn't be more than 100,000 or so years old. But radioactivity was discovered. Radioactivity is why the Earth is still as warm as it is. It's why the Earth has been able to sustain its internal heat all these millennia. And this discovery, it's something like this question, without radiometric dating, how would you view the age of the Earth? To me, it's akin to the expression, well, if things were any other way, things would be different. This is to say, that's not how the world is. Radiometric dating does exist. Neutrons do become protons, and that's our level of understanding today. The universe is accelerating. These are all provable facts. That there was a flood 4,000 years ago is not provable. In fact, the evidence, for me at least, as a reasonable man, is overwhelming that it couldn't possibly have happened. There's no evidence for it. Furthermore, Mr. Ham, you never quite addressed this issue of the skulls. There are many, many steps in what appears to be the creation or the coming into being of you and me. And those steps are consistent with evolutionary theory.
And that is time.
It must have been easier for you to explain this a century ago, before the existence of tectonic plates was proven. If you go into a clock store and there's a bunch of clocks, they're not all going to say exactly the same thing. Do you think that they're all wrong? The reason that we acknowledge the rate at which continents are drifting apart, one of the reasons, is we see what's called sea floor spreading in the mid-Atlantic. The Earth's magnetic field has reversed over the millennia, and as it does, it leaves a signature in the rocks as the continental plates drift apart. So you can measure how fast the continents were spreading. That's how we do it on the outside. As I said, I lived in Washington State when Mount St. Helens exploded. That's a result of a continental plate going under another continental plate and cracking, and this water-laden rock led to a steam explosion. That's how we do it on the outside. I will go along with most people and say green, and it's an irony that green plants reflect green light.
Did I not say one-word answer?
Most of the light.
I said one-word answer.
Most of the light from the sun is green, yet they
color?
reflect it. It's a mystery. Second law of thermodynamics is fantastic, and I call the words of Eddington, who said, if you have a theory that disagrees with Isaac Newton, that's a great theory. If you have a theory that disagrees with relativity, wow, you've changed the world, that's great. But if your theory disagrees with the second law of thermodynamics, I can offer you no hope. I can't help you. And the second law of thermodynamics basically is where you lose energy to heat. This is why car engines are about 30% efficient. That's it, thermodynamically. That's why you want the hottest explosion you can get in the coldest outside environment. You have to have a difference between hot and cold, and that difference can be assessed scientifically or mathematically with this word entropy, this disorder of molecules. But the fundamental thing that this questioner has missed is the Earth is not a closed system. So there's energy pouring in here from the sun, if I may, day and night, because the night it's pouring in on the other side. And so that energy is what drives living things on Earth, especially for, in our case, plants. By the way, if you're here in Kentucky, about a third and maybe a half of the oxygen you breathe is made in the ocean by phytoplankton, and they get their energy from the sun. So the second law of thermodynamics is a wonderful thing. It has allowed us to have everything you see in this room, because our power generation depends on the robust and extremely precise computation of how much energy is in burning fuel, whether it's nuclear fuel or fossil fuel or some extraordinary fuel to be discovered in the future. The second law of thermodynamics will govern any turbine that makes electricity that we all depend on and allowed all these shapes to exist. Well, of course, this is where we disagree. You can prove the age of the Earth with great robustness by observing the universe around us. And I get the feeling, Mr. Ham, that you want us to take your word for it. This is to say, your interpretation of a book written thousands of years ago, as translated into American English, is more compelling for you than everything that I can observe in the world around me. This is where you and I think, are not going to see eye to eye. You asserted that life cannot come from something that's not alive. Are you sure? Are you sure enough to say that we should not continue to look for signs of water and life on Mars, that that's a waste? You're sure enough to claim that. That is an extraordinary claim that we want to investigate. Once again, what is it you can predict? What do you provide us that can tell us something about the future, not just about your vision of the past? We remind us there are billions of people around the world who are religious and who accept science and embrace it, and especially all the technology that it brings us. Is there anyone here who doesn't have a mobile phone that has a camera? Is there anyone here whose family members have not benefited from modern medicine? Is there anyone here who doesn't use email? Is there anybody here who doesn't eat? Because we use information sent from satellites in space to plant seeds on our farms. That's how we're able to feed 7.1 billion people, where we used to barely be able to feed 1 billion. So that's what I see. That's what we have used science, or the process. Science for me is two things. It's the body of knowledge, the atomic number of rubidium, and it's the process, the means by which we make these discoveries. So for me, that's not really that connected with your belief in a spiritual being or a higher power. If you reconcile those two, scientists, the head of the National Institutes of Health is a devout Christian. There are billions of people in the world who are devoutly religious. They have to be compatible because those same people embrace science. The exception is you, Mr. Ham. That's the problem for me. You want us to take your word for what's written in this ancient text to be more compelling than what we see around us. The evidence for a higher power and spirituality is, for me, separate. I encourage you to take the next minute and address this problem of the fossils, this problem of the ice layers, this problem of the ancient trees, this problem of the ark. I mean, really address it. And so then we could move forward. But right now, I see no incompatibility between religions and science. So it sounds to me, just listening to you over the last 2 minutes, that there's certain parts of this document of the Bible that you embrace literally and other parts you consider poetry. So it sounds to me in those last 2 minutes like you're going to take what you like, interpret literally, and other passages you're going to interpret as poetic or descriptions of human events. All that aside, I'll just say scientifically, or as a reasonable man, it doesn't seem possible that all these things that contradict your literal interpretation of those first few passages, all those things that contradict that, I find unsettling when you want me to embrace the rest of it as literal. Now, as I say, I'm not a theologian, but we started this debate, is the Ken Ham's creation model viable? Does it hold water? Can it fly? Does it describe anything? And I'm still looking for an answer.
And time on that. Mr. Nye, here's a new question. I believe this was miswritten here because they've repeated a word, but I think I know what they were trying to ask. Have you ever believed that evolution was accomplished through way of a higher power? I think that's what they're trying to ask here. This is the intelligent design question, I think. If so, why or why not? Why could not the evolutionary process be accomplished in this way?
Okay, I think you may have changed the question just a little bit. No, it's all good.
The word-for-word question is, have you ever believed that evolution partook through way of evolution?
I think I thought, but let me introduce these ideas for Mr. Ham to comment. The idea that there's a higher power that has driven the course of the events in the universe and our own existence is one that you cannot prove or disprove. And this gets into this expression agnostic. You can't know. I'll grant you that. When it comes to intelligent design, which is, if I understand your interpretation of the question, intelligent design has a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of nature. This is to say, the old expression is if you were to find a watch in the field and you'd pick it up, you would realize that it was created by somebody who was thinking ahead, somebody with an organization chart with somebody at the top, and he'd order screws from screw manufacturers and springs from spring manufacturers and glass crystals from crystal manufacturers. But that's not how nature works. This is the fundamental insight in the explanation for living things that's provided by evolution. Evolution is a process that adds complexity through natural selection. This is to say, nature has its mediocre designs eaten by its good designs. And so the perception that there's a designer that created all this is not necessarily true, because we have an explanation that is far more compelling and provides predictions and things are repeatable. I'm sure, Mr. Ham, here at the facility, you have an organization chart. I imagine you're at the top, and it's a top-down structure. Nature is not that way. Nature is bottom-up. This was the discovery. Things merge up. Whatever makes it keeps going. Whatever doesn't make it falls away. And this is compelling and wonderful and fills me with joy and is inconsistent with a top-down view. There's a reason that I don't accept the Ken Ham model of creation, is that it has no predictive quality, as you touched on. And something that I've always found troubling. It sounds as though, and next time around you can correct me, it sounds as though you believe your worldview, which is a literal interpretation of most parts of the Bible, is correct. Well, what became of all those people who never heard of it, never heard of you? What became of all those people in Asia? What became of all those First Nations people in North America? Were they condemned and doomed? I mean, I don't know how much time you spent talking to strangers, but they're not sanguine about that. To have you tell them that they are inherently lost or misguided, it's very troubling. And you say there are no examples in nature. There are countless examples of how the process of science makes predictions. Hang on. There's no evidence that humans are getting smarter. No, especially if you ever met my old boss. No, it's that what happens in evolution, and it's a British word that was used in the middle 1800s, it's survival of the fittest. And in this usage, it doesn't mean the most push-ups or the highest scores on standardized tests. It means that those that fit in the best. Our intellect, such as it is enabled us to dominate the world. I mean, the evidence of humans is everywhere. James Cameron just made another trip to the bottom of the ocean, the deepest part of the ocean, the first time since 1960. And when they made the first trip, they found a beer can. Humans are everywhere. And so it is our capacity to reason that has taken us to where we are now. If a germ shows up, as it did, for example, in World War I, where more people were killed by the flu than were killed by the combatants in World War I, that is a troubling and remarkable fact. If the right germ shows up, we'll be taken out. We'll be eliminated. Being smarter is not a necessary consequence of evolution. So far, it seems to be the way things are going because of the remarkable advantage it gives to us we can control our environment and even change it, as we're doing today, apparently by accident. So everybody just take a little while and grasp this fundamental idea. It's how you fit in with nature around you. So as the world changed, as it did, for example, the ancient dinosaurs, they were taken out by a worldwide fireball, apparently caused by an impactor. That's the best theory we have. And we are the result of organisms that lived through that catastrophe. It's not necessarily smarter, it's how you fit in with your environment. Would you repeat the question?
The question is, what is the one thing more than anything else upon which you base your belief?
As my old professor Carl Sagan said so often, when you're in love, you want to tell the world. And I base my beliefs on the information and the process that we call science. It fills me with joy to make discoveries every day of things I had never seen before. It fills me with joy to know that we can pursue these answers. It is a wonderful and astonishing thing to me that you and I are somehow at least one of the ways that the universe knows itself. You and I are a product of the universe. It's astonishing. I admit, I see your faces, that we have come to be because of the universe's existence. And we are driven to pursue that, to find out where we came from. And the second question we all want to know, are we alone? Are we alone in the universe? And these questions are deep within us, and they drive us. So the process of science, the way we know nature, is the most compelling thing to me. And I just want to close by reminding everybody what's at stake here. If we abandon all that we've learned, our ancestors, what they've learned about nature and our place in it, if we abandon the process by which we know it, if we eschew, if we let go of everything that people have learned before us, if we stop driving forward, stop looking for the next answer to the next question, we in the United States will be outcompeted by other countries, other economies. Now, that would be okay, I guess, but I was born here. I'm a patriot. And so we have to embrace science education. To the voters and taxpayers that are watching, please keep that in mind. We have to keep science education in science classes. Thank you.